Mr. Bhaskhar Sunkara, thank you for being with us. It's an honor. Let me start. You are now the editor and publisher of Jabobin. Your parents were migrants from Trinidad and Tobago in New York, and I would like to know what was the most determinant thing for your class consciousness? Maybe something from your child life, maybe university?
hmm Yeah, I think for me, I became politicized when I was in as young as 13, 14 years old. And for me, the key thing was seeing how much of life was a result of accidents at birth. So I myself am the youngest of five children. My three oldest siblings didn't go to college. I saw, in other words, how much of my life outcome was a result of complete accident. One, being the only family member born in the US. Two, having access to very good public goods. My mom was just a telemarketer. My dad was a civil servant. So at the very best, middle class. But I was in an area that had a strong school system, lots of libraries, sports activities, public goods, and so on. So at the very least, I would say organically, given this background and experiences, I became a social democrat or someone committed to a broad and inclusive public sphere. Now, beyond that, I started reading randomly Marx and Trotsky and the British thinker Ralph Miliband and a host of Michael Harrington, the American socialist writer, a host of other people, and I developed an intellectual interest in a particularly Marxist variant of socialism because, in fact, I saw the way in which, if we want to make the reforms of socialism durable, we have to grapple with the political and economic power of capitalism. So, in other words, I would say my organic politicization was a social democratic one, but then intellectually and historically exploring the limits and contradictions of social democracy led me to a more radical, more Marxist version of socialism. But I should say that I still am deeply appreciative and of how profound the gains of reforms can be, and I think that those of us on the left can't lose sight the fact that people day to day are fighting for a few more dollars in their hourly wage, a little bit more dignity and respect and autonomy, and we can't counterpose ourselves to those movements of reform.
Mhm. You are against the end of the history, no? But maybe we are in the end of the history, but not the end of the oppression, no?
Um, I don't think we're in the end of history, in part because, for one thing, capitalism has been around for a very, very long time. But its contradictions are still with it too, and so are its mechanisms of stability. So, for example, when we talk about the contradictions of capitalism, we talk about the fact that a small minority of people control the means through which society as a whole produces goods and services, and that everyone else is at their whim. This is the old kind of Marxist story that I think holds up pretty well. But the mechanism of stability is the fact that any worker is dependent on their capitalist who they work for to make a living. So we, in other words, might want to demand higher wages, but we have to keep our demands within the framework of capitalist profitability. In other words, we want our respective capitalists to be competitive and profitable. Same thing at the level of the state. A center-left government, a left-wing government in power needs to maintain a base of profitable firms in order to have a tax base to actually build their social programs upon. There's tons of mechanisms of stability, but by one measure, the workers' movement is not weak and defeated, but in fact has actually transformed much of the world that we live in. So the past 150, 160, 170 years have seen the rise of the 8-hour day. We've seen the rise of really expansive welfare states. We've seen, in other words, the achievement of a lot of core working class demands. And for a movement that started in the middle of the 19th century and its modern form in the late 19th century, I don't think we could just read back the history of the workers' movement as completely a history of defeat. And of course, for those in Spain, in Catalonia, you have seen the victory of even democratization that has come from below and come from the workers' movement and other progressive elements in civil society. So I don't think we should take for granted these victories. I think they were contingent victories. None of them were victories that were just handed to us. And I think we should say that history is still alive and politics is still alive. There's no inevitable outcome of socialism, certainly, but it remains a possible future, and a future that if we don't want to fall into the future of climate barbarism or right-wing populism, should want to go towards.
Mm-hmm. In your book, The Socialist Manifesto, you started showing us a small company called Bon Jovi Film Brand that makes proletarian pasta sauce and introducing a big union movement inside the company. As you said, here in Catalonia, we had an experience of factory collectivization during the Spanish Civil War. But in 21st century, in a very technological industrial change process, do you still believe that workers and unions can be owners of the companies?
Yes, I think actually, in fact, our vision of a social society has to be rooted in a competitive, so I'm a socialist plus a competitive, a market sphere with worker ownership, or at least worker control. And obviously, you had the experience of during the Spanish Civil War of revolutionary cooperatives being formed, but afterwards, even in Franco's regime, you had the growth of efforts like Mondragon, which obviously didn't have the same revolutionary roots, but I think in practice has quite revolutionary implementation. So, in other words, Mondragon is in the Basque Country surely not a exercise in revolutionary socialism, but it is a reminder that we can run firms without capitalists. So, in other words, we saw the experiences of 20th century state socialism. And from that, we should draw a few conclusions. One is about the limits of central planning. Central planning can be very good to catch up a country to a certain level of development. But in the end, you end up with a society and an economic system that if it's a hand, it has all thumbs and no fingers. So, for example, you have a government that can build a lot of T-34 tanks and can mass vaccinate people and can provide basic hospitals and education and things like that. In other words, or even build social housing that doesn't require much customization, but has a very hard time keeping up with consumer desires, has a very hard time responding to any changes, has a very hard time with complex technical innovations as economies become more developed and more complex. All these are very well-known problems of central planning. Now, to me, one of the key problems of the Soviet Union beyond this is the lack of competitive pressures, soft budget constraints, and allowed inefficient firms that were pretty miserable to work at to continue, to the detriment of both the people working there and consumers. And I think we need a model of socialism that has firm failure, that has competition, but is still based on egalitarian premises. And I think market socialism provides a way to solve many of the key problems of the Soviet experience, while at the same time saying that we don't need a permanent class of capitalists to run our societies, that in fact, your average ordinary worker can run society. It's a very unusual thing that we live in capitalist democracies that trust workers to elect presidents and prime ministers and members of parliament, and people control so much of the economy, but won't give a single bit of democratic say to those same workers to make decisions in their workplace where they have so much expertise, where they have so much knowledge, where they spend 8 hours, 9 hours a day. I think that really is a contradiction that we could do away with.
And what's wrong with social democracy like Sweden, for example?
Well, I think social democracy is, in its achievements, the greatest societies that we've ever built. These are societies in which, by mere accidents of birth, it did not, by the height of social democracy in the mid-1970s, it didn't matter much where you were born in Sweden. You still had broadly the chance to reach your creative potential. You had access to strong universal social goods. The private sector was dominated in many ways by the LO and by the power of centralized bargaining, the LO being the main trade union federation. And of course, they had a period of social democratic governance stretching from the early 1930s until the late 1970s of nearly uninterrupted rule by social democrats. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the accomplishments of social democracy, but we need to focus very much on the period of social democratic rollback and decline. Not because we should fall into this idea of total retrenchment. So by retrenchment, I just mean that, yes, welfare states all across Europe, and including in the Nordic countries, especially in Sweden, out of the Nordic countries, have been eroded over time. But many of the key planks of the welfare state still exist. But why has the advance of the welfare state been halted everywhere? And I think this owes a lot to the political and economic resistance of the capitalist class. And I think it owes a lot to the inherent contradictions of social democracy. So in other words, a Swedish capitalist could say in the 1950s that, yes, I have to deal with more redistribution. I have to deal with this meddlesome LO trade union confederation. But at the very least, I have more stability. My workers are not on strike the way they are in France, or even the way they are in the UK. We have a system to manage these disputes. The LO in the end respects management's right to manage. They bargain very hard, but they respect management rights on the shop floor. But it turned out that giving people some social rights made them not more meek, but in fact made them more combative. So by the late 1960s, Swedish capitalists are finding that workers are starting to demand not just redistribution and social goods, but industrial democracy. You're also seeing other problems with the system. So when times are good and profitability is assuring and they don't have any other options, a capitalist will deal with a social democratic settlement. But when you hit moments of crisis, like in the 1970s with the OPEC oil shock, with just the general decline in growth and profitability, with the increasing wage demands of workers, we had to find a way to resolve this crisis. And one way was through the backs of the workers, and the other way was a more radical break from social democracy to some form of democratic socialism. So I think, in other words, there is inherent instabilities in social democracy. But of course, we should also acknowledge the real gains of social democracy. And we should see this as the triumph of the same workers' movement that has the same common origin as more radical strains of socialism. So we should claim the triumphs of social democracy, in other words, as our own, but we should talk about the limits. And if possible, we should try to go beyond social democracy.
Which was the result of 2008 crisis for working class?
Well, I think it depends place by place, country by country. I think that in the United States, for instance, the situation of working class people, there was in fact a recovery after 2008, 2009. In other countries, there hasn't been a full recovery. In places like Greece, and even in Portugal to some degree, there's been more of a recovery lately. But there's been long-term ramifications of not just the financial crisis, but the debt crisis that grew soon after it. Now, in the United States, you saw the total collapse of a lot of people's household incomes and savings because we had a system where working people in the US actually had fairly high rates of home ownership. So their only source of savings, these are debt-ridden people. They have lots of debt, just like any worker in the advanced capitalist world will have consumer debt, credit card debt, and so on. But Americans also have student debt. We also have medical debt because we don't even have a universal welfare, universal healthcare system. So in the end, as a pathway of social advance, working class people were trying to use their homes, build equity in homes that maybe they could sell one day so they could retire, or maybe they could rent out or something like that. They tried to use this as a pathway to the middle class. And, obviously these are the same people who've been seeing stagnating real wages for decades. They've been seeing that the only way they could even maintain their consumption patterns has been through credit card debt to make up for declining or stagnant at best real wages. So I think you're seeing that a lot of this household wealth has been wiped out, especially among Black Americans and other minority groups. But in some, I think there was recovery, and there has been restoration of growth, at least up until this recent coronavirus crisis. The question is who the growth is benefiting. Increasingly, the growth in the last 30, 40 years has been benefiting only the top 5% or so of earners, only the top capitalists and managers and others in this system, and that's why we need to fight for a different sort of system. This isn't even an abstract call for socialism. Our immediate demands on the American left are for things like a massive infrastructure building program built around green energy and the fight against climate change. So tying, in other words, environmental struggles with the struggle for increased employment and infrastructure building, especially in neglected and deindustrialized areas. These are all things that are extremely important for our program going forward.
Workers can obtain power through elections?
Yes, I mean, I think the history shows that the answer is definitively yes. The workers' movement has taken power across much of the world through elections. The real question is, how can we bring about a shift from capitalism to socialism, to an economy that is not just a more redistributive form of capitalism, even a more radically redistributive form of capitalism, but into an alternative political economy. And I think as a necessary, but maybe not sufficient criteria, we need a democratic mandate that comes from a majority of working people, and we will win that mandate and demonstrate that we have that mandate through elections. States, democratic states in particular, have a great deal of legitimacy among working people, in part because they were constructed through the struggles of working people. They've been shaped through the struggles of working people, and there are avenues of democracy that allows people redress. So within, let's say, the Spanish state, though, of course, within Catalonia, better than others how still undemocratic and Francoist aspects of the Spanish state are. But within the Spanish state, within Portugal and these other countries, they were the result of democratic traditions. In the case of Portugal, an actual democratic revolution, a revolution to establish a republic and democracy. These are all things that were victories of progressive forces. And it seems to me that even when socialists think about what a governing political sphere would look like after the revolution one day, they should think about the parliament as being, in fact, a form of working class inputs on a capitalist society. And in fact, I believe in the permanence of parliaments. I believe they should be continued indefinitely. And maybe you mix parliaments with form of direct democracy, what the old left would call Soviet democracy. Maybe you do that. But I think that representative democracy is a form, if combined with real economic power at the shop floor, of working class rule.
Populism plays with the anger of the people, no? Is it possible for the left to take this anger of the people to vindicate a more equal society?
Yeah, well, I think populism is just a tactic. It's just a rhetoric. So of course the left can use that tactic, that rhetoric. You've seen it with Podemos. You've seen it with other forces using this language. I think we lose something if we take populism too seriously as a capital T theory and a replacement for past worker-centric views of socialism, for past modes of thinking that center around class in a more straightforward way. So in other words, the Lacau and Mouffe version of populism I would reject, but the softer version that many of their acolytes practice, the version pushed by Popular Iglesias and others, is a version that I would embrace. Because it's clear that Iglesias's project is a project of the left. Agree with him or disagree with him on any particular point, he is a man of the left, and that is a project of the left. And the rhetoric they use is more populist in orientation, let's say the rhetoric I would use. But in the end, it's about creating a polarization broadly along class lines, and it's about building a broad base of support for a pro-working class program. That's what it is. Now, there are versions of populism that I think go too far into falling into the trap of dissolving certain identities and dissolving the need for permanent organization. So, for example, often you have extremely hollowed parties. So populist left forces are responding to a breakdown in political participation and engagement, but they are constructing parties with very little cadre building, cadre formation, building of trained activists. They're constructing parties with very little democratic inputs, with very little even internal democratic centralist democracy. There's none of that. There's just, ironically, a very hollowed centrism, often ratified through plebiscites and things like that. So I think the irony is, instead of addressing the hollowing out of civil society, they are reinforcing the hollowing out of civil society. So I'm much more in favor of traditional forms of socialist organizations, of working class organizations. I think even in the UK, who would believe that in the UK, the Labour Party became under Corbyn a much more vibrant working class party than many of the new populist parties of elsewhere in Europe. But certainly, I think that the rhetoric, broad, inclusive rhetoric, and a focus in this current conjuncture on elections makes perfect sense. So I do applaud some of the populist turn, just not all of it. And when it comes to the populism of the right, this is always a danger, because we could see that center-left, traditional center-left voters, working class voters, have left many of the parties of the center-left as a result of the transformations of those parties in the 80s and 90s. The growth of third-way social democracy might have preserved portions of the welfare state, but it completely hollowed out the base for those parties. In general, those workers have not gone to the parties of the populist right, but more often than not, they just dropped out of politics. The share of working class participation in politics is over. Now, I think I'm back now. Back?
Yes, can we start again in a point?
Sure. So it's not clear to me. Let's see, where was I? If we look at the last 30, 40 years, at least since the 1980s, we've seen the decline of the working class base of center-left parties. And along with that, a decline more broadly in working class politicization. So it's not that workers, by and large, are moving to the parties of the populist right. It's that they're dropping out of politics completely, as the social base of their historic parties have eroded, and as those parties have not responded properly to the growth of neoliberalization. I mean, it's incredible that the parties of the traditional European workers' movement, the socialist parties of Europe, are now by and large supporters of the European integration as a project, particularly of the European Union. It's shocking to me that these parties haven't been able to establish any sort of program built around reindustrialization, at the very least responding to the needs of their former industrial base. So in a few cases, very worrying cases, in Germany, for instance, in East Germany, where older pensioners are still voting for Die Linke, but they never made the switch to voting for the SPD after reunification. You're seeing the rise of the AfD. You're seeing, obviously, in Hungary and in other cases, the rise of a worrying populist right. You're seeing in France a lot of areas that used to vote for the Communist Party now swinging towards the Front National, the FN, or whatever the renamed FN is. And obviously, within the Spanish state, you're seeing the worrying rise of Vox. So to me, these are the vacuum being created by the center left, and it's very worrying, especially because this narrative of anti-immigrant stuff has occurred in a condition of relative abundance. So what would happen when there's actually conditions of scarcity? There's an economic crash, plus there's, due to climate change, a mass exodus of people from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, from parts of the Middle East or Asia to Europe, just people looking to secure a better future for their families, trying to flee climate destruction, wrought and obviously by the industrial countries of the world. And if right-wing populism gains so much steam with the influx of just Syrian refugees, imagine what it would be with this influx to come. So I am worried about that form of populism, of course, but our solution should be not a center-left turn away from populism, but a turn towards the concerns of working people and being able to use non-racist, non-xenophobic populist rhetoric to diffuse the power of the right.
Mm-hmm. We have now the first generation that they believe that they are not living nevermore better than their parents. No, they don't believe in politics. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think it depends where. I think in Spain you're seeing the rise of a certain anti-politics, apathy, dejection around, especially among the youth. In the Anglo-American world, things are far more promising. People are responding to this decline in living standards, or this perceived decline in status or living standards compared to their parents. And they are supporting broadly candidates of the left. So both Corbyn and Sanders had overwhelming support among the youth. So it's a country-by-country situation. I think, in fact, in the Anglo-American world, our job is to convince older, particularly male voters, to rejoin the political process and to rejoin the parties of the historic left and workers' movement, or at the very least, candidates of the left in the US case. So these are these are difficult things, are country by country case studies, I think, and we need to examine them in a little bit more detail. But obviously, in a lot of Southern Europe, you are seeing a retreat away from politics and the feeling of hopelessness. And the only way we can give people hope is to show them that through politics, we can improve their lives. So we need to win some small victories in the here and now in order to really cement and galvanize the base for left-wing politics in the future.
You told us that Bernie Sanders' proposals, like housing, like healthcare, had the majority opinion with him, no? And why Bernie Sanders lost the primaries?
Yeah, one way to put it is that Bernie Sanders finished second in a field of over a dozen candidates. So Bernie Sanders, I think, had a tremendous amount of success. The bottom line is that Donald Trump is hated and despised, and Americans wanted who they perceived to be the most electable candidate to contest him. So after an anti-establishment election in 2016, it seemed that people wanted to return to normalcy, even if they didn't particularly like the old normal. And that's behind a lot of the support for Joe Biden. Not to mention the fact that he was the vice president to Barack Obama, you know, historically popular figure. So I think all of this made it a very difficult battle for Bernie Sanders. It is true that on the ideological agenda, Americans are for universal health care, they are for the Green New Deal, they are for action on trade and whatnot, all these other things that are part of the core Bernie Sanders repertoire. I think, unfortunately, he couldn't make up for the fact that Joe Biden was just better liked than even Hillary Clinton and other candidates at a apolitical level. He was associated with the very popular Barack Obama, which especially mattered in the Black American communities. And moreover, people really want Trump out of office, and that's our number one concern. The number one concern of voters in the Democratic primaries was not healthcare, it wasn't their jobs, it wasn't that, it was just getting Donald Trump out of office. What's really interesting, too, is that even though Sanders dominated with younger voters, there was no flood of younger voters or working class voters that had dropped out of the system. There was, however, a flood of wealthy suburbanites, center-right leaning suburbanites who might have voted for Republican in the past, but find Trump so odious at a cultural level, find him disagreeable, and voted in the Democratic primaries and will vote for Joe Biden. So if all your politics comes reduced to we must defeat Trump at all costs with any coalition, you know, this is the logic. And in the end, you end up with a lot of former Republicans flooding into the Democratic Party. So Biden had that to his advantage. We based our idea on the fact that we could get working class voters that were semi and non-voters. We could get them into the system for the first time. And it didn't really work. We did not get this flood of new voters, and that's why we came up short. And it's worth noting that they did get a flood of new voters, but those voters were traditional center-right voters who just find the Republican Party too odious and maybe too far right for their taste now.
Mm-hmm. You are a member of Democratic Socialists of America, and at the same time, also you are a member of the Democratic Party. What's the meaning of this double participation? No?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not a member of the Democratic Party because in the US, we don't really have membership-based parties. So it's kind of confusing to understand, but one way to put it is that the Democratic Party cannot expel members. And beyond that, the Democratic Party does not even run its own internal elections. Primaries to determine the candidates of the Democratic Party are administered by the state, and anyone can register to vote in them. So I register as a Democrat so that I could vote in the Democratic primaries. I support efforts to run socialists and other progressive candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line. But I'm not subject to the discipline of the Democratic Party because no one is subject to the discipline of a party in the United States. So instead of thinking of it as a two-party system, like you used to have, at least within the Spanish Republic, used to have a traditional two-party system. In the US, we really had a no-party system. But because of restricted ballot access law, it's extremely difficult to near impossible for us to get an independent ballot line. So we have a system more similar to soft, semi-authoritarian systems like Singapore or Russia than to the rest of the advanced capitalist world, at least parliamentary democracies. So the Democratic Socialists of America, by and large, we run our candidates on the Democratic Party ballot line in order to just contest a meaningful election. If we ran on a third-party ballot line, like the Green Party, then we would simply not be able to contend for working class votes because we'd be taking ourselves out of the entire debate, and because a lot of working class people don't want to vote for a perceived spoiler in a first past the post system.
And just now, the objective of the Democratic Socialist inside the Joe Biden campaign, what's the objective just now for you?
Well, we do not, by and large, as an institution, and me myself as an individual, will not be endorsing Joe Biden. But we certainly will find other ways to oppose Donald Trump. So we're going to be running candidates, including on the Democratic Party ballot line, down ballot candidates, and encouraging votes for them. So in other words, we're not supporting a third-party spoiler, but we're not affirmatively campaigning for Joe Biden, which has caused some debates on the U.S. left. I've written about the decision a bit in both the New York Times and in The Nation magazine. I think maybe for European viewers, my point of comparison might be the debate around in the second round, Jean-Luc Mélenchon not voting for or not openly endorsing Macron as a anti Le Pen candidate, though of course opposing and denouncing Le Pen. The idea is, how can the left build up its own forces so we can actually be a credible force down the road, without, of course, sacrificing and electing a right-wing populist in the short term. So that's our delicate balancing act. But the bottom line is that we can't be the junior partner in a coalition if we don't have any forces of our own. And that's behind a lot of the logic of the American far left, avoiding direct campaigning for Joe Biden and instead campaigning on our own issues. But Bernie Sanders and a lot of the mainstream left of center forces in the U.S. are, in fact, critically supporting and campaigning for Joe Biden.
Then imagine that Joe Biden wins. You still believe that it's necessary to create a third big workers' party in the States?
Well, I think in the long run, the goal of any working class movement has to be the creation of independent political representation for the working class. We have encountered such barriers in the US that it seems nearly insurmountable. So I would say that's a medium and long-term goal. In the short term, the goal will be to create an organization, an independent organization, even if that organization has to run candidates on the Democratic or even potentially Republican ballot lines, but particularly the Democratic Party ballot line. But yes, in the long run, it would be great to have an independent workers' party. It's a long, frustrated dream of the American working class. We've been attempting it in various forms since the 1800s, and we failed at every step. That's one reason why, for those in Europe who want to completely write off every single party of the center left, it's worthy to consider that even bad workers' parties were the product of mass struggles and were not guaranteed. We're living in the alternative history in the United States, the history where efforts to create such a party failed, and we don't have a welfare state as a result. We have medical debt, no health insurance, and a very, very much underdeveloped welfare state as a result.
Racial conflicts like George Floyd protest can be reflected then in the polls, in the elections?
So far, we're seeing broad support for the protests in the United States. We're seeing the continued decline of Trump. It might be that if protests continue, there'll be some sort of backlash, and maybe voters will be voting for Trump to restore order. There might be what in the US we call the Bradley effect of white people in particular saying that they're voting for the left or center left candidate, in this case, Biden, but in fact voting for the more conservative on racial issue candidate in Trump. I tend to think that Trump is really in trouble, and that it is unlikely that he will be able to win re-election, but we'll see.
Do you think there is a conjunction between three supremacies, like white supremacy, male supremacy, and human supremacy against the planet?
I mean, I reject the idea that white supremacy has much explanatory power. No doubt, we live in societies with legacies of racism, especially in former slave societies like the U.S. No doubt we need to struggle against the legacy of this racism and continued acts of racism, police violence, and abuse. I wonder that how much, as a word, white supremacy. The same thing with the idea of male supremacy is all men are not created unequal. So there's an old bell hooks line which says you want women to be equal to men, but men aren't equal to men. So if we want to build, as we should, a movement for feminism, a movement to win key rights, maintain reproductive rights, and win other rights for women, win a more expansive welfare state that will allow women more power to leave abusive relationships and so on. This will require the solidarity and work of male working class people too. And I think in general, we need to push the idea that any privilege that any member of society might have, let's say a white male worker might have, is a relative privilege compared to the absolute advantages that they would have in even a social democracy. So we have to say, in other words, to everyone, you have something to gain from our political program. Otherwise, our politics just collapses into moralism. When it comes to human supremacy, I mean, we are the masters and custodians of the planet. Any solution to climate change will happen through more human interference, not necessarily less. So obviously we need to reduce emissions. Obviously we need a very a different sort of political economy that's sustainable. But man's mastery, humanity's mastery over nature is something that is relatively innate to human civilization. We need to learn how to operate and build our civilization within ecological limits, but we should be very, very skeptical of a vision of climate change that says that we are all equally responsible. I don't know about you, but I don't own a coal power plant. You know, I don't own big factories. I certainly am not the great beneficiary of fossil fuel intensive industrialization. I think we need to inject, in other words, a class component into all those things, even the question of the environment. But as far as human supremacy, unlike those other things, unlike racism, which is socially constructed racism, unlike the subjugation and abuse of women throughout the ages, I think that human supremacy over the planet is something that will endure as long as there is human civilization. Of course, if we continue our current route, there might not be human civilization at some point in the next millennia or so if climate change continues unabated.
Do you think this crisis of coronavirus can be the result of this exploitation of the planet?
No, I think fundamentally, I guess you could say the coronavirus wouldn't have happened if not for certain forms of livestock cultivation and things like that. But that's a product of living in a good society, not a bad society. We have 7 billion people on the planet. We have almost 8. We have the means to feed them all. We have a massive, we've seen in Brazil and China and elsewhere, massive reductions in poverty in the past few decades. We've seen, in other words, huge amounts of advance, and the left cannot reject that growth and that progress and counterpose ourselves to that. There's still almost 3 billion people on the planet living with under $1.50 a day. There's still a need for a lot more development. I think, if anything, the fact that we've reached such levels of development has actually allowed states to effectively respond in most cases to the coronavirus outbreak, to establish the wealth for public health infrastructure, and to even develop such wealth that we're able to halt production or large parts of production for many months without falling into extreme misery, without falling into extreme new forms of hunger. These are all triumphs of civilization. And I think if we want to solve this and other crises, we want to solve the crisis of climate change, we're going to need to solve it from the perspective of civilization and from the deepening of development and growth, of course, in a sustainable zero emissions way. But we can't fall into the trap of saying we need to go backwards to a more primitive state, because in the end, that'll only cost millions more lives, untold lives, and it'll especially hurt those in the global south.
Can be many social unrest. We are in front of a change of maybe the start of a new revolutionary era.
Well, I think we're entering into an era of capitalist instability, but capitalism is always unstable. more often than not, these areas of capitalist instability benefit the right as opposed to the left. So obviously, what happens next depends on politics. Capitalism is increasingly looking like it doesn't have the answers of the future. It's up to us to put forward a socialist alternative. Otherwise, the only alternative on offer will be the xenophobic, racist, and very just narrow and sad perspectives of the populist right. We live in this beautiful, rich, diverse planet, 7.5 billion people of all these different continents and backgrounds and cultures. Can you imagine how narrow and pathetic it would be to fall into another lapse of right-wing nationalism? Can you imagine that given the advances in communications technologies and travel and whatever else, will co-sign our sons and daughters to a future where they live more narrowly and less connected with the rest of the world? So in other words, we need a left that is internationalist, that is optimistic and confident. It can present that vision of the future to the world, and I think we'll win over narrow parochial views if we do it that way. But if we have a left that embraces the pseudo-integration of, let's say, the European Union, then in fact we'll open ourselves up to that being the only opponent to right-wing nationalism. I think instead we need to think more radically about visions of the future and how to make them palatable to ordinary people. The goal of the left isn't and can't be to just be a little confessional thing where we just talk amongst each other about how miserable the world is and how we need an alternative. The goal of the left has to be always to reach more and more people and to be a formation, an ideology, and composed of parties and organizations that are of, by, and for working people.
Thank you very much, Bhaskhar Sunkara.